moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows that danced across the quiet suburban neighborhood. Sarah had always been a light sleeper, but lately her nights had been plagued by a relentless and inexplicable insomnia. The nights had grown longer, and the darkness more oppressive. One evening, as Sarah lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, she heard a faint rhythmic tapping. At first, she dismissed it as a figment of her sleep-deprived imagination, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct with each passing moment. It was coming from the window. Curiosity got the better of her, and she slowly pushed the covers aside and crept out of bed. She tiptoed to the window and peered through the curtains, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw sent a shiver down her spine. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood in the darkness outside her window. Its limbs seemed unnaturally long, and its fingers tapped rhythmically against the glass, producing the haunting sound that had roused her from her restless slumber. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the figure. She couldn't see its face, only a vague, shadowy outline. It stood perfectly still, as though it were waiting for something, or someone. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away. Minutes turned into hours as Sarah continued to watch the figure outside her window. The tapping never ceased, and she couldn't tear her gaze away from it. The room grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over her like a heavy fog. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the figure turned away from the window and melted into the darkness. Sarah was left trembling, her body drenched in cold sweat. She stumbled back into bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. She knew that this was just the beginning, that whatever had visited her that night would return. Night after night, the figure returned. It would stand outside her window, tapping on the glass, its presence becoming more palpable with each passing night. Sarah's once vibrant and energetic demeanor had been replaced by a hollow shell of her former self. She had become a prisoner in her own home, unable to escape the relentless torment that haunted her every night. Desperate for answers, Sarah turned to the internet, scouring forums and websites for any information that might explain her torment. She stumbled upon a thread where others had shared similar experiences. The figure outside their windows, the tapping, the insomnia, it was all eerily familiar. One user on the forum claimed to have found a solution, a ritual that could banish the nightmarish intruder. The instructions were cryptic and unsettling, but Sarah was willing to try anything to end her suffering. She gathered the necessary items, a small rusted knife, a piece of chalk, and a black candle, and waited for the next night. As darkness fell once again, the tapping began. The figure was back, its presence more menacing than ever. Sarah lit the black candle and began to draw a circle on the floor of her bedroom with the chalk. She placed the knife in the center of the circle and recited the incantation from the forum post. The room grew colder as Sarah chanted the words, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the tapping on the window stopped. The figure outside seemed to sense what was happening and grew frantic, pounding on the glass with a fury that sent cracks spider-webbing across the surface. But Sarah continued the ritual, her fear giving way to determination. She could see the figure's shadow growing more and more distorted, as though it were being pulled away from the window by some unseen force. It let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the night, and then, in an instant, it was gone. Sarah's heart was still racing as she collapsed to the floor, the ritual complete. She had done it. She had banished the nightmarish figure that had haunted her for so long. Exhausted but relieved, she crawled back into bed and finally, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. The next morning, Sarah awoke feeling more rested than she had in months. The sunlight streaming through the window felt warm and comforting. She couldn't believe that the nightmare was finally over. But as the days turned into weeks, a nagging unease began to creep back into her life. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her insomnia returned, and the tapping at her window resumed. Terrified, Sarah went back to the internet, desperate for answers once more. She returned to the same forum where she had found the ritual, hoping to find a solution to her new torment. But the thread was gone, as though it had never existed. In a state of panic, Sarah began researching ancient rituals and obscure occult practices, hoping to find something, anything that could help her. Night after night, she tried different incantations and performed bizarre rituals in a desperate attempt to banish the entity that continued to torment her. But nothing worked. The figure outside her window grew bolder, its presence more malevolent. It no longer confined itself to the window. It began to manifest within her home, lurking in the shadows, its long, bony fingers reaching out to touch her in the dead of night. Sarah's physical and mental state deteriorated rapidly. She became emaciated, her once lustrous hair now dull and lifeless. Dark circles formed under her eyes and her skin took on a sickly pallor. She was a mere shadow of her former self, a prisoner in her own personal nightmare. One fateful night, as Sarah lay in bed, the figure appeared at the foot of her bed. It stood there, its hollow gaze fixed on her, its lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched in horror. She knew that there was no escape, no way to banish the entity that had taken over her life. It had consumed her body and soul, and now it was ready to claim her completely. With a bone-chilling cackle, the figure lunged forward, its long, bony fingers closing around Sarah's throat. She gasped for breath, her vision fading as the darkness closed in around her. In her final moments, she realized the terrible truth. There was no escape from the relentless torment of no sleep. And with that realization, Sarah's world went dark, her soul forever trapped in a never-ending nightmare.
It all began on a stormy night in the quiet town of Eldridge. The cobblestone streets glistened under the pouring rain, and the old lamplights gave off an eerie glow. Sitting atop the hill was the Ashford Manor, an ancient house with an ominous reputation. Jane and Max had just moved into Ashford Manor, excited to start a new chapter in the town. They had bought the property at an unbelievably low price, disregarding the town folks' whispered warnings about the curse that plagued the manor. The first few nights were uneventful. They settled in, appreciating the manor's ornate wooden carvings and exquisite stained glass. But on the fifth night, things changed. Jane woke up to the sound of a lullaby. It was gentle and distant, like an old gramophone playing from the floors below. She shook Max awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Max strained his ears. "It's probably the wind. Go back to sleep." But the lullaby grew louder. Jane sat upright, her heart racing. She could hear the soft hum of a woman's voice, singing a tune she couldn't quite recognize. They decided to investigate, clutching each other's hands as they descended the grand staircase. The music seemed to be emanating from the manor's old library. Pushing the door open, they were met with a chilling sight. An ethereal woman dressed in white, with long flowing hair, was swaying back and forth, holding a baby in her arms. Jane gasped. The woman looked up, and her empty eyes locked onto Jane's. "Why did you wake him?" she whispered. The baby in her arms was unnaturally still, its eyes shut tight. Max pulled Jane back, but it was too late. The woman's lullaby grew distorted, and the baby started to wail, the sound echoing throughout the manor. The next morning, Jane and Max were at a loss. The town's elder, Mr. Hawthorne, reluctantly told them the story of the cursed manor. Decades ago, the lady of the house, Isabella Ashford, had lost her baby to an unknown illness. Heartbroken, she made a dark pact, trading her sleep for a chance to see her child again. But the entity she dealt with twisted her wish. Isabella was doomed to roam the manor, singing lullabies to her deceased child, while the curse made sure that no one who entered the house could sleep peacefully. Jane felt a chill run down her spine. That night, and every night that followed, they tried to sleep, but the sound of the lullaby and the wailing baby filled their ears. They were never able to rest, plagued by horrifying nightmares whenever they closed their eyes. Dark shadows danced on the walls, and cold hands reached out to grab them from underneath the bed. Desperate for a solution, Jane sought the help of a local occultist named Lydia. Lydia, with her vast knowledge of the supernatural, suggested performing a ritual to free Isabella from her endless torment. They prepared the manor, drawing protective circles and lighting candles. At midnight, Lydia began chanting, and Jane and Max joined in. The house started to shake, and the lullaby grew louder, mixed with angry hisses and screams. Suddenly, the ethereal figure of Isabella appeared before them, her eyes filled with rage and despair. "You cannot break the curse," she shrieked. But Lydia continued chanting, her voice unwavering. Hours seemed to pass until, finally, a blinding light filled the room. The lullaby stopped, replaced by the sound of a baby's gentle cooing. Jane looked around and saw the ghostly figure of Isabella holding her baby, both smiling peacefully. With tears in her eyes, Isabella whispered, "Thank you," before she and her baby faded away, leaving the manor in silence. The curse was lifted. Jane and Max could finally sleep, their nights filled with peaceful dreams. They decided to turn the manor into a sanctuary for those seeking rest, and renamed it the Sleepless Retreat. The manor's story became legendary, drawing visitors from all over. People claimed that spending a night there would give them the most restful sleep they'd ever had. But every so often, on stormy nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the soft hum of a lullaby echoing through the halls of the Sleepless Retreat.